Welcome to Testing in the Pub.
Welcome to the third Testing in the Pub podcast session. Today we're going to talk about mobile testing and the challenges that come with mobile testing and generally everything around mobile devices.
Yeah, we'll try and talk about as much as we can in around about 20 minutes. So
the first thing that I want to get out there, Steve, is Windows Phone. Why have you left Windows Phone?
Thank you, Dan. Why have I left Windows Phone? In an effort to remain relevant to a majority of the users, certainly within the UK or within Western Europe. Although Windows Phone does have a higher market share in Europe, in fact I think as high as 13% in Italy. Worldwide it's at about 3%, whereas by volume Android is up in the 70s I think now, practically.
It's true.
By volume, of course.
By sheer awesomeness, it's right up there. It's my favourite type of device.
Well, there you go.
So anyway, right, more important matters.
Absolutely.
So since we're on that topic of having tons of different Android devices, let's face it, the reason that there's 70% of the market share is because there's so many different flavours of Android.
Fragmentation.
Exactly.
That's the key thing. Yeah. Especially if you're talking about Android, you're not just talking about Android as in the Google port of Android. You're also talking about the Android open source project.
Yeah.
Forked versions of Android that things like the Kindle Fire are based on. A large number of Chinese manufacturers. Nokia now with the X device. Yes, yeah. With the X series, they've got three Android devices based on a fork.
Yeah. I thought you said that you had bought 3 there.
I have not bought 3. I haven't bought any of them yet, although I know a fair few people who are involved in designing them, but that's another story.
I've seen some screenshots, so it kind of rips off Windows Phone a little bit.
That's absolutely deliberate.
Is it?
Yep.
Ooh.
Yep. And I think the reason it's absolutely deliberate actually brings out a really interesting point about fragmentation and about mobile testing in general, which is you need to know your customer and you need to know the market segment that the application you're testing is actually aimed at. So take the X series as an example. That's aimed to sit below Windows Phone in Nokia's portfolio, and it's aimed to be for emerging markets only.
Yeah.
It's not trying to take over their high end.
Yeah.
Conversely, say you worked, I don't know, for a luxury e-commerce company, you might find that a large proportion of your users were using iPhones. And therefore, if you were doing your testing and you were testing an application which you knew was primarily targeted at people in developing countries, you may pick that Nokia. You may probably not choose to pick the iPhone as your default test device.
That's an interesting point that you make.
The key thing when you're testing for mobile is to know your customer and make friends with your UX team. A lot of companies do usability testing. A lot of companies have customer profiles that they put forwards. A lot of companies go out and talk to potential customers. Do your research, like any testing. And there's some parts of mobile testing which are very unique, and other parts which are absolutely common with any other part of software testing. And a risk-based testing strategy is key. When it comes to the risk of launching on devices you haven't tested on, clearly what you need to do is understand your customers, target your testing at the devices that you think, not only that you think they will be using, but also try and think a little as forward-looking as you possibly can, and if time permits, then consider devices that are further down your list of priorities.
Yep, good points. So when it comes to fragmentation then, how would you tackle fragmentation with, if you've created a mobile app, particularly with Android, say for example, you create an Android app, do you narrow it down to specific devices?
Yep.
But then on those devices they support multiple versions of the operating system, so even at that level it's still fragmented?
It's unlike, it can be a bit of a Pandora's box, but in reality, stats are easily available on the web that will tell you not only what devices are in the field, if you haven't managed to get that sort of information either from an existing application your company has because there's a lot of analytics and tracking data that you can get from mobile apps that people in companies will have access to if it's installed. If it's a new app or a new company, then you can get a lot of that data off the web. Look at the devices that are most in use and look at the versions of the operating system that are most in use as well. So I mean, use Android as an example. Jelly Bean is the prominent version of Android OS at the moment. KitKat, the latest one, still pretty low. I think it's still only at about 2.5% of the user base are actually using KitKat.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, you need to understand the market that the software you're testing is going to be launched into.
Yeah. And then you've got the dynamics of mobile apps and mobile websites as well. So
and hybrids.
And hybrids as well. Yeah. So if you've got a website, then websites can be accessed on any device already. So you've got that data there of who's looked at your app. But mobile apps slightly different. Maybe if you've just created an app, then you won't have that data up front.
You may have data from a similar application. So say
competitor apps.
Okay.
Well, so.
You're less likely to be able to get that information from a competitor. But if you work for a consultancy company, for example, you may have launched similar applications before. If your company produces, I don't know, m-commerce applications, they may have released other m-commerce applications which are relatively similar. Also, you can take some, you can learn from stats you can get from mobile web. So if your company's got mobile websites and they're building a mobile application, the likelihood is you can look at some of the traffic that hits that mobile website and you can extrapolate from there.
Yep.
Any work you do in that area is going to really pay dividends.
Yeah, definitely. You need to focus your devices down. You can't test on every device. There's just far too many.
No, and you may also have to just make some hard choices and say, well, look, we don't support this version anymore. Yep. As an example, I mean, you can iOS. Most users now are, because of the nature of the way that Apple updates iOS, most users are now on iOS 7. There's some users on iOS 6. There'll be some users on iOS 5.
Yeah.
But I would argue if you're launching an iOS app at the moment, you probably don't need to waste your time on iOS 5 because the risk and frankly the reward is not going to be great enough to do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It depends on, because you need to think about, especially with iPhones, you need to think about length of contracts as well. So I'm pretty sure that there's still people with an iPhone 4 or
they've all been
iPhone 4S.
They're all upgradable.
Oh, are they?
Yeah.
Oh. So I thought that iOS 7 wasn't available on the iPhone 4. Well, some devices due to the memory.
As a general kind of point of principle, general tip for iOS, I would support the current version and the previous one.
Yeah.
So I'd support 6 and 7 at the moment, particularly because 7 is such a seismic shift away from 6 in terms of UI, in terms of the elements available, and in terms of how you would develop for iOS. There's so much more available to the developer in iOS 7, and from personal experience, a lot of iOS 6 applications broke when iOS 7 came out.
Yeah.
Not very badly, but just little bits and pieces broke. So there's certainly it's not a binary break in the code path by any means between the two, but it's definitely they're not completely forward compatible.
Yeah, I think when you're choosing your devices, it's similar to, I guess, how you would choose your browsers for a desktop website.
Yeah, absolutely.
What browsers do you support? So it's the same with mobile devices.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's probably the most common question people ask me. It's about fragmentation. Some of the questions they don't ask me, which very often, which I think are very valid as well. In fact, probably the second most important thing when testing mobile, and that is don't sit in your office about 10 meters away from your perfect Wi-Fi connection and test your application over Wi-Fi, because that's a really, really common mistake. It's big companies and small companies are just as guilty. I mean, the Twitter app until very recently that I had on my Nexus 5, it really didn't like my commute home. It would do some really, really funny things when I was on the train and the mobile reception was going up and down. It was switching between 2G and 3G, maybe switching between GPRS and enhanced GPRS, data speeds changing, data speeds dropping, changing from cell to cell as it went through the mobile network at relative speed. It used to do some really funny things, and it's really, really important that if you're testing a mobile application, you get up out of your desk and you wander around. You maybe test it on the way home. Figure out some sort of route that you know that is going to go through areas with good reception, areas with bad reception.
It's all about location and connectivity, isn't it? So
yeah.
But yeah, like you said, taking motion into account as well.
Motion's really important because as it affects basically what you're doing is you're affecting the quality of the network connection. So it's possible within Xcode, so for iOS, to kind of simulate poor connections, but it's certainly not as good as the real thing. Because if you're moving quickly with your phone is going from one cell in the network to another cell. So mobile networks are basically composed of cells. And as you go from one to the other, your connection is essentially handed over from one base station, so from one aerial to the next one, and then to the next one, to the next one, and that has an impact on the network performance, particularly at the boundaries of those cells. That network performance issue could cause some funny things in your app. It could cause timeouts. It could show error conditions that are not intended to be shown. It could show situations whereby you're expecting that there's some expectation of a response from a server which doesn't come.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It kind of leads into how your device settings can affect things as well, because thinking about things like power save mode, that'll automatically cut off like Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, things like that.
Actually, power save mode is very good. Leads quite nicely into probably the third most important thing about mobile testing, and that's do not forget about the effect that your application has on the battery life of the device.
Oh yeah.
So some badly written apps, particularly ones with in-app advertising, can do some horrible things to the battery life of a phone. And the great thing about mobile is that users can download your application very quickly, very simply and very easily. They can use it very quickly and simply and easily. They can leave you some awful feedback and uninstall it very quickly, very simply and very easily.
Yeah.
And
that's one of the first things that I do if I'm looking to download an app. I'll look at the ratings.
Yeah.
I'll read the first handful of reviews, and that effectively makes up your decision on whether to download that app or not.
Yeah. And you start if you've got an application and the battery life is bad, then you can bet that's not going to go down well with users. They'll figure out what application it was that suddenly started causing battery life issues. And yeah, I mean a mobile device is limited processing capability, it's limited power. The last thing you want to be is somewhere without access to your device because your application happens to run the battery down twice as fast as usual.
There was one app that I did see that was quite funny. It was actually a battery checker app where it would tell you your battery power. Rather than see the bar go down, it showed you in numbers, so you could see it. But that actually drained the battery more than without having that app.
Yeah,
so that was quite funny. But that's a prime example.
Yeah, it does actually. It ties in a little bit also to what we were talking about before, about the effect of poor network connection on a device. I mean, a poor network connection will inherently run the battery down on a device quicker because the radios in the device are spending more power essentially trying to maintain a stable connection.
Yep.
However, what's also going to happen with a badly written application in that respect is it's going to kind of magnify that. It's going to magnify that effect.
It's interesting But thinking of going back to how settings and things then, so like you've got power save mode that and affects the battery, but what other device settings could actually affect that then? Because thinking about it, you've got things like your language settings, I guess. Your what else do you have?
A whole bunch of stuff. I mean, if you've got a location-based app, you may have settings on your phone to enable different levels of location. So whether you, for example, you choose to leave the GPS on all the time, or whether it's done by Wi-Fi-based location, or whether you turn location off, you can turn the data off on connection off on most devices. You can set it to be Wi-Fi only, for example. There may be interactions with other parts of the device, language, keyboard, camera.
That's true, yeah. Keyboards, that's a big one.
Yeah.
I'm always irritated by apps that don't think about how the keyboard's going to display on the screen, because, for example, you are trying to enter text into a field, and then you click on the field and the keyboard pops up over the field, and then the app doesn't move with the keyboard.
One of my minor little gripes is, or rather, the sign of a good app is where it contextualizes the keyboard. So if I'm entering an email address, I'd quite like one of those buttons to turn into .com, please. It's possible on most devices. I'd quite like a search box to turn the return key into a search key, or a form to turn the last one to turn that return key into a finish key. Well-written apps do that, and it's that sort of knowledge that I think, from a testing perspective, that's where giving that information as a tester, I think, can really add value to mobile projects, because it's that understanding of what's really going to give us a really good application versus a usable, but let's be honest, relatively average one.
Usability.
Usability and design is important. I like the phrase "design for fat fingers," which is not supposed to be in any way derogatory, but a well-written application, you can use it and it feels natural, and the buttons and the on-screen buttons and stuff, they're in the right they're in the right place. You don't have to think about them. Soft keys, i.e. buttons on the screen, don't jump around between screens. So for example, you don't have OK on the left and then you go to the next screen and it's suddenly gone to the right or something like that. It's something very counterintuitive. So the actual design for mobile is, if anything, it's actually more important than on the desktop, because you've got so much less real estate to play with. So you've got to get it right, because if you get it wrong, it's really obvious, and B, exceptionally frustrating. And typically devices now are touchscreen, whereas on the desktop, even now, kind of less so.
That's another challenge when it comes to mobile testing, is the touchscreen. When it comes to things like automation and using simulators and things like that. So a simulator, this is where it really falls down, I think, because of the fact that you've got one mouse.
Yeah, there's a number of gestures you can use on a simulator. Typical, so say, take the simulators that come with either the Android SDK or come with Xcode. There's a number of there's a lot of gestures you can do with the mouse. It's not very nice to do.
I know you can pinch and zoom and things like that, but you can't do like a 10-finger touch.
You can't.
5-finger, so you can't do a 5-finger pinch, which is like you can do on an iPad, for example.
It's a very fair point, and also something to kind of bear in mind, and it feeds kind of back into that fragmentation discussion earlier, is a lot of these gestures are not available if you start using the kind of web-based devices. So there's a couple of companies that offer you devices in the cloud, and that's one valid way of if you haven't got access to all the devices you need, you can go rent them and basically interact with them through a web browser. But again, I mean, they're still quite laggy, so they're not brilliant, and you don't get full access to all the gestures that you would have if you actually owned the device itself, or had access to it.
You've got the benefits of it being cheaper than buying in all the devices.
Although I would say, before you decide to hang your entire test strategy on using a cloud-based service, go and try and use a cloud-based service, because they are still frustrating to use. They're not ideal, and there's obviously security concerns with putting maybe personal company data on a device. I mean, both the more popular companies offer private clouds, but that may still not be enough to fit in with the security policy in the company that you work, for example.
That's a very good point. But you'd always want to buy in your key devices anyway. Do your research, discover what your most common devices are, which are most common operating systems, and buy them in, basically.
Yeah, buy them in, or worst case scenario, get access to them somehow. Open device labs are beginning to spring up more and more, which are a great way of getting access to different devices. There's a couple in London. I know there's a few in Brighton and a few other places. So they're beginning to become more accessible. They're a great idea.
Yeah, I think they're a great idea as well. So let's talk about mobile security. Mobile security is a hot topic at the moment.
It is.
One really, I think it's quite a famous bug. I can't remember what the app was though. What the bug was that if you installed the app, then you had to log in. So then it would save your login details. So every time you started the app, you were already logged in. But if you uninstalled the app, then reinstalled it again, it would have your login details already saved from the first time you installed it. I think that's a massive security issue.
Yeah, well, it's kind of similar. The most recent one of those was the Starbucks app. The Starbucks app was saving your login details in plain text on the memory of the device. Not good. It doesn't do that anymore. They plugged that one, but it does show that's a very basic data at rest security scenario, mobile security scenario, and I think it's not the only one. I mean, key from a security perspective on mobile is obviously you have that data at rest, you have the data in transit, so you have maybe the ability to, say for example, sniff the Wi-Fi connection. It's more difficult, although not impossible, to hack cellular connections. It's been done, but I don't think it's done regularly. Whereas people who set themselves up with any old Wi-Fi router call it free Wi-Fi and then see how many people connect and then sniff the packets that are coming through there. That happens quite frequently, I think.
Yeah.
And it's certainly something to look out for. I mean, there's a lot of stuff around mobile security. It could be the subject of a whole podcast series of its own. But one thing I would say, if you're interested in mobile security, I mean, obviously there's the OWASP stuff, and there's a VM called Mobisec, which you can download, which contains all of the relevant mobile security tools. It contains the relevant versions of the relevant SDKs for Android and an iPhone, and a couple of sample projects. You can spend hours learning mobile and kind of messing around essentially with mobile security that way without doing anything which is actually going to cause any damage in the real world.
Yeah,
it's a great way to learn.
I think it's fantastic, but it's essential to know the basics. So if you're testing mobile apps, it's essential to know the basic security risks. For example, the uninstalling the app, you need to make sure it clears all information, not just the app itself, but any saved data that's on the actual device.
Yeah, and make sure that saved data is not being saved in a plain text form. Make sure that if it's being saved in a SQLite DB, that SQLite DB is secure. It's not admin and password, for example, to get in. Make sure that the app is not communicating over HTTP rather than HTTPS, for example. A lot of this sort of stuff it's not mobile specific per se. It's equally valid from a desktop perspective.
Yeah.
The difference, I guess, maybe a little bit with mobile is certainly data at rest. So stuff stored on your phone. A lot more phones are stolen than people's desktop PCs. So I would argue that therefore secure data storage on phones is actually more important.
True.
But I think also just kind of touching on other areas that's really important to consider with mobile testing, which you kind of just jogged my memory, is interactions between different parts of the device or different apps on the device. So, say your application's running and you lock the lock screen and then you unlock it. Mm-hmm. Does your app resume properly? Does it resume quickly? Does it resume in the same state that it was? Does it suddenly restart itself from the beginning? What happens if you've got, say, you're playing music in the background? What happens if you're downloading something in the background? What happens if you pop up some notifications over the top? All of these things where your app is essentially being interrupted by another action on the device. Those are all the ones which are less likely to have been considered by the development testing. And they're the sorts of ones that really annoy users, particularly the one where if you interrupt an app, it basically resets itself back to the start, so back to the state at which you'd actually started the app.
Yeah, and also it's a great point you make about the audio as well. Like the amount of times that, like, I'll download a new game for playing on the tube journey home, but I'll be listening to my music at the same time, and if I'm listening to my music, I don't want the noise of the app. So a lot of the games out there, they recognise that the music is playing, so they don't play the music in the game. But like the amount of times I've downloaded games and the game music will try and play over the app music, and that's really irritating as well.
Yeah, precisely. And in my experience, you see a lot of crashes when using audio controls over the top of running apps.
Yeah.
Again, it's an interruption essentially, and also to a certain extent it's where you begin to start stressing the device. So what happens if you are using an app and downloading a YouTube video in the background and playing a bit of audio and doing this, that and the other? There's only limited processing capability even on the fastest devices and limited memory. I mean, we're still only talking about a couple of gig of RAM on devices.
Yeah.
So how do they deal with that? How does your application deal with that?
So that kind of leads on to memory then.
Yeah, both memory, ROM, both on device memory and also external memory. So a lot of devices take external SD cards, write to external SD cards. What happens if those cards are full? What happens if those cards are removed when the app's running? What happens or inserted when the app's running? What happens if those cards are read-only? For example, all of these, they're all interactions ultimately with an external media. What happens when you plug your phone in, for example, and maybe mount it for some devices, like Android devices? What happens if you mount it as an SD card against your desktop machine?
I used to have an old Motorola phone that if I'd plug it in at night time, the battery would last a day, so I'd plug it in overnight. But every morning, because of the length of time that the phone was plugged in, it would crash. And
that brings a very good point actually, and that's the point about memory leaks. Mobile devices are quite unique. I mean, I can't tell you the last time I turned mine off, as an example. I do what you say. I mean, I've got an Android device. The battery life isn't the best. I charge it overnight. I don't turn it off. I just plug it in. It probably hasn't been turned off for about 3 or 4 weeks now. That will expose memory leaks in applications, and if the underlying OS isn't good enough at cleaning up those memory leaks, then what you're going to do is you're going to have an application that then starts having an effect on the overall performance of the whole device, not just that application itself.
I'm the same. Like, thinking about it, I hardly turn my phone off at all. But should that be a requirement? Should the apps all handle that, or
the app shouldn't leak memory, and then it wouldn't be a problem. It wouldn't be a problem if they didn't leak memory. If an application doesn't leak memory, and therefore basically if an application cleans itself up regularly, it shouldn't make any difference whatsoever.
What about mobile automation then?
What about mobile automation? Yeah, the wild west of mobile automation.
Yes.
Yeah, we're at where we were probably 5 or 6 years ago at the moment with mobile automation. I.e., there's a lot of different solutions. There's some open source solutions. There's some vendor-based solutions. Everybody will tell you that their solution is the best. Some of the solutions are good. Some of them are well maintained. Some of them have an active user community. Some of them used to be well maintained and used to have an active user community, and now they don't. So if I was doing mobile automation now, I'd pick the ones with the best future, which to me, there's a solution called Appium, and there's one called iOS Driver, and both of those are being rolled into the specs for Selenium 3.
Appium's pretty good.
Appium's good. Appium doesn't play so nicely with iOS 7 at the moment. It will. But as it stands right now, it doesn't play so nicely. It also doesn't play as well with Java as it does with Ruby.
I think one of the problems with tools like Appium are the fact that there are so many updates that come along from the mobile manufacturers and the operating system updates that are on the devices. So it's difficult for the people that make the tools to keep up to date with that. You know. So
but I would always, as I say, I would always go with a solution which is relatively future-proof. Appium uses wire protocol as well, Apple's underlying protocol, which means that it's much more likely to remain working. It's not one that requires some sort of third-party server to be installed on a device or within an application, which itself throws up other issues. So there are other automation tools which basically require you to change the underlying code of your application. Now, there's a certain argument that says if you do that, you're not actually the software under test is not actually the software that you're launching. So that adds inherent risk. You may choose to accept that risk, but it still adds risk ultimately to your project. So there's no perfect solution for automation on mobile at the moment. There is some better solutions than others, and that's it.
There's never going to be one perfect solution, is it?
I don't know. I mean, I'd argue we're in the position from a desktop perspective now with WebDriver, where we have a good solution, a good, mature, well-supported open source solution. We don't have that yet on mobile.
Cool.
So, Dan, that was a very quick overview of mobile software testing. There's obviously a lot more to it. I think if people want to find out more, then there's a lot of material out there on the web. I'm not going to blatantly plug my own blog too heavily. There's a little bit on there. I'm always around on Twitter to answer questions as well. There's a few others of us who specialise, I guess, in mobile software testing as well. I would say sign up for a mobile software testing class just before Test Bash, but it's sold out, so can't do that.
That just means you need it again, Steve.
Absolutely. But hopefully everyone found that useful. It's a really interesting area to be involved in. I think it's very fast-paced mobile, and you very quickly get to see the results of what you do in the hands of people in the street, which is why I find it a really exciting area to work in. That's it. We'll see you next time on Testing in the Pub.